good. Happy to be started. Let's start the talk now. So, let's talk about communicating linguistics. This is something that I said at my very first talk about communicating linguistics to a general audience. And then I saw someone who was at that talk 4 years later, and she commented this was something that stuck with her from the talk. So I'm going to say it again, but in large letters behind me, because that's how you communicate effectively. But this is something that I think misses a lot of us in academia, because we're used to tolerating bored audiences. We're used to tolerating audiences that are checking their email. And I admit, I have been a person in an audience checking my email. I may have been doing so this morning, in fact, for which I apologize to the presenters from Google. Oh no, they've gone home, they won't hear this, that's great. So I have been the person who had, urgent business, but I still wanted to go to the talk, and I had a few things to do. And I regret this, but I don't regret it deeply enough to stop doing it, evidently. So, but you can have an engaged audience. You can experience that feeling of the whole room in the palm of your hand, willing to come with you where you want to bring them. And even though people like getting their inbox cleared out, let me rephrase that. Even though people would rather their inbox be cleared out than not, and tolerate the process of doing so occasionally, people like even more being brought along on an interesting talk. And so if you can make your talk, you have the right to try to make your talk sufficiently interesting that people are no longer bored enough to want to check their email. And you don't get this for free, but you can get it. You can be engaging. It's okay to want people to be engaged with your talk. You don't have an academic obligation to be boring because that's how serious scholarship works. You can have serious scholarship that presents facts and figures and so on, and is also engaging. So I want to say that this is something you're allowed to try to earn, even though most of grad school will not teach you how to get there. And that's the second part. It's hard. It's not immediately obvious how to engage an audience, how to bring them along. Most of the reasons that I know anything that I know about doing this is from all of the stuff that I've done in my life that's not linguistics, including competitive public speaking, working at a museum as a tour guide, where if you have to entertain like 30 bored teenagers, you need to learn how to be engaging. So certain trials by fire that I have learned these things from, it wasn't academia that taught me this. Although now I'm perfectly happy to trade on reputation. Oh, you're a linguist, that must be why you're good at public speaking. Sure. Yeah, feel free to, people who are not linguists, feel free to believe this. It makes me good at all the language stuff, including public speaking. But that doesn't mean that you can't learn it. And in many cases, what we have as linguists is the ability to reverse engineer. Here are the things that other people have done that make their explanations effective. We can look at, literally, the discourse effects, or the morphosyntactic effects of what this explanation I find it compelling, this one I find dry. What is the difference between what these people are doing with their words that changes the effect of this particular explanation? So if you take nothing else from this talk, I want you to apply your linguistic skills when you're reading an article and it's surprisingly engaging, or you just can't focus on it. There are things there that you can reverse engineer. But if you don't want to do that, because it's hard, I'm going to do some of that for you. And the first question that I want to present you with is, what does it feel like to have an engaged audience? What does it look like when someone's paying careful attention to you? So we're going to do an exercise. I want everybody to stand up and find a partner, just wherever you are.
Yeah, more people, less.
And then maybe you should have done the explanation part before I told you all to stand up, because you're now talking, which would be fine, except I now need to explain to you what you're doing. If you want to do this seated, you can do that too with a partner from sitting down. So does anybody not have a partner? Do we have anybody else who doesn't have a partner? You can join a group of 3 if you want. So what I want you to do with your partner, in your partnership, one person raise a hand. Okay, this person is the leader, the other person is the follower. You guys are to mirror each other, face each other, mirror each other, do some actions, and follow the other person. Silently! You can step out some always.
I don't know what else to do. I think, well, no. Okay, there you go.
Silently as possible. Quietly. Quietly. The job of the leader is to do things that the follower can follow. If the follower is not following you, you're doing your job as the leader badly. Don't talk, just act.
People sitting here.
Careful of the.
People sitting here.
I mean, there's open spaces for sure. No bags.
Now you're going to swap positions. The previous leader is now the follower. Okay, now you're going to do one more version, and this time, pay close attention because this one's tricky. Neither one of you leads and neither one of you follows. You come to your decisions by mutual consensus. If this means that you move very slowly, that is entirely okay.
I think so. Oh, there's 2. Okay.
So it's like. Someone else is lost.
All right, everybody back to their seats. So what I wanted to do with this activity, and when I do full-on LingComm, workshops where we do more activities, because there's nothing like an activity, is to let you experience for a moment what it feels like to have someone's full attention on you. And it's terrifying, and the responsibility is a lot. And it's okay to be terrified of the responsibility of having a whole audience's full attention on you. But once you start enjoying it, it's also really fun. And once you have that feeling of an engaged audience, you don't want to go back. So you can try experiencing that feeling in miniature before trying to feel that should be the kind of attention that everyone wants to give you when you're speaking, because you can be that interesting or that bizarre, as the case may be. So that was a brief taster of what an engaged audience feels like. I want to briefly digress into what a lot of us talk about when we talk about pop linguistics, is we want to engage the general public. But I am really sorry to break it to you that there is no such thing as the general public. Because, as you might have noticed from the scare quotes, because the public is really a subset of a lot of types of people. For some values of things people might want to reach, this room is the general public. we're trying to convince everybody to recycle or something, this room can count as a subset of the general public. It's not the general public if I'm giving a linguistics lecture. It is a narrowly specialized audience. And so what you're trying to do when you're saying, I want to reach the general public, that's a question that's too broad. It's easier for you if you can say, I want to reach a particular type of person in this case. Because I have people say, oh, I need to reach the public because I want to do X. And they don't realize that the public is too big of a group that they want to reach. So sometimes the public is families with young children because we want them to come into our lab to do our psycholinguistic study. In which case, this room may or may not actually be a good group to be trying to reach. How many people have young children? Okay, so like a few people. Not that many, right? So in that case, your general public, you may be trying to reach out to a daycare or something. Sometimes the general public is like high school students because we want to convince high school students that linguistics is cool and maybe they want to major in it. Sometimes the general public is like, you know, people who are curious about science and we want to convince them that linguistics is a science and they should be curious about that as well. There are lots of different kinds of general public. Sometimes the general public is very local. If you want families with young kids to come into your lab, it's not useful for you to get national media because that's going to reach too big of a group. And what you actually want is local attention. But if you're trying to reach, or if you're trying to reach, you know, people who are curious about science is even very broad, right? Then you could say, where do people who are curious about science get their news? So the second question is, where are they? Where can you find a disproportionate concentration of people who are in whatever group you're trying to reach? So parents of young children is going to be different from high school students, is going to be different from like adults who are curious about science. Though they're going to be reachable through different means. You know, if you can get on like a science-focused blog, this may reach people who are curious about science. It's not necessarily going to reach local parents of young children because who knows where everybody is when they're trying to start this. So a lot of people say to me, oh, I want to do public engagement, should I start a Twitter account? I'm on record as somebody who likes having a Twitter account, curiously. But starting a Twitter account is not an effective way to reach parents of young children in your local demographic, in your local metro area. Because do they have Twitter? Maybe, some of them, but how do you find them? You may have more luck reaching like a parenting Facebook group in your, let's specific for your local area where people like trade used cribs or something like this. Because that's the kind of group that's going to reach parents in your area. Or if you're trying to reach, you know, local high schoolers, you probably want to go to a local high school. If you're trying to reach people who are curious about science, that's going to be a different group as well. And the third question is, what do they want? Because it's all very well to reach people if they don't care about your message. Like, congratulations, we found the parents of local children. You know, they all go to this daycare which only cares for children under 5, so we know they're in the right age for our study. But we can't convince any of them to actually come to our study because it turns out that it's a nuisance for them. They have a hard time getting there because we only do it on weekdays and it would be easier for them if it was on weekends. Or they are not sufficiently incentivized by the like $2 that we're giving them and maybe we should give them more money or a better prize. Or like a t-shirt instead because they like t-shirts better. Or they hate t-shirts, right? So what do they want out of the study? What do they want out of this particular type of thing? Do they want to be entertained? Do they want something there? So any public engagement project is reaching a certain kind of public. And this can apply to things like governments and university administrations as well. You know where they are. The question is, what do they want? Do they want media results? Do they want local media results? Do they want, you know, evidence of public-private partnerships? You know, what are the things that they want out of whatever this engagement project is? These are questions that can help focus how you're engaging. I want to talk for the rest of this time about specific tips and tricks for doing some of the stuff that many of us often want to do when it comes to pop linguistics. So one of the big things that a lot of us want to do is myth-busting. It's like, people believe that some languages are better than others. People believe that there are only like, I don't know, maybe 20 languages in the world. People believe that like the kids are ruining the language. People believe you can fill in the blank here with like whatever you heard from your latest like taxi driver or person sitting next to you on an airplane. Or relatives. Definitely relatives. So there's all this stuff that people believe that we find very frustrating. And the most difficult part of this frustration is sometimes you can tell them explicitly, yeah, no, this is wrong, and they won't retain that. And that's even more frustrating because you tried so hard. And I want to give you a case example here from one of the myths that I've been trying to bust for several years now. I won't even say how many years because it's been like too many years now. And this is the myth that I get faced with a lot as an internet linguist, which is emoji. They're the new language, right? They're a universal language, right? And people don't even think this is like a busty sort of thing to have. They're just like, this is clearly self-evidently obvious as a belief. Like, that's very interesting because they're not. Because no, and they're not. And I used to try to bust this belief by saying no and not a lot. And saying no, they're not. In fact, linguists have a definition for what a language is, and like there are very clear, parameters for how this would work, and it doesn't work. And in theory, one could make a system that would work, but that's not actually what we see in terms of usage. And all of these arguments that intuitively appeal to us as the type of people who like metrics, and who like taxonomies, and who like diagnostics for things. Unfortunately, this didn't work. So I would spend, an hour with a journalist on a phone call, and I would say, yeah, no, they're not a language, here's why they're not a language, and they really aren't, and here's why they're not, and they're still not, and here's some other reasons why they're not. And then I'd end up in an article where the headline would be emoji new language, and I'd be quoted in there. And I know that the journalist doesn't write the headline for their own article, but somehow this has managed to not sink into them enough that they couldn't communicate this to their editor that this was still an incorrect quote. Or they managed to find the part where I would say something like, if emoji could be a language, they would do this, but not this, and that would be the only bit they'd excerpt. And like that would be the bit that they'd be like, yeah, that's the one I agree with, so that's the bit I'm going to quote. And be like, I spent half an hour saying not, and you found the one conditional, and you're going to use that one instead. I wrote an entire article about how emoji are not a language and they're not ruining English and all of this stuff, and I managed to get somebody quoting that article who shall remain nameless because they did send me a preprint version of their academic paper. They're not a linguist, obviously, and let me correct it before publication, but somehow this person had managed to read this entire article in words, on a page that said not, and still extract the quote, like mangle the quote on extraction with some ... dots because they were so convinced that what I clearly must be saying in the article was that emoji must be a language. I spent a lot of time on this particular myth because it's just weird. Because you've got to have a really weird conception of what a language is to think that emoji are part of them. So it kind of ties into a bigger question of like, what even is language? So I tried really hard, and I failed. And what I wasn't paying attention to was this thing that I had kind of known for a while, but was not paying enough attention to, which was this. You can't just negate a myth. You need to replace a myth. So you can't just pull out, you can't just send some negation into someone's brain so they can put it in front of their myth. Because that does not work. I stand here to tell you, my name is Gretchen McCulloch, and myth-busting via negation is ineffective. What does work is replacing myths. Replacing myths with a more compelling narrative. How does this thing actually work? What is a narrative that I could give people about emoji that would let them have a different narrative in their mind, something that they could latch onto? And that would, even if it kind of degraded through memory and through faux re-explanation, would at least point them in a different direction. And this is why I started talking about emoji as gesture. Because rather than saying they're not language, they're not language, they're not language, they're not language, I now try to avoid saying the word language near the word emoji at all. Just like not in the same sentence. Because like people's memories are valuable and they degrade. And if you say it in the same sentence, it just causes problems. So people say to me, like there are certain words I just don't say in emoji interviews because no matter how many knots I put in front of them, they won't survive. One of those words is hieroglyphs, just never say it in the same paragraph with emoji. Hieroglyphs very cool, but they're also phonetic. Like people don't know what hieroglyphs are is the real story here. But, so, by saying emoji are gesture, this this replaces emoji as language. Clearly language is used to communicate, gesture is also used to communicate. And as it happens, even if you have, so this idea does work if you go into the depths of the gesture literature, which my co-author Lauren Gunn and I have done in a paper that came out last week with Language and Internet. And we've gone into the gesture literature and done a whole bunch of comparisons, and it really works out quite neatly, and we're quite pleased about this. However, this is also kind of irrelevant when it comes to the myth-busting side, because it doesn't matter whether I run a journalist through all of these interesting correspondences. They're in the academic paper, you're welcome to read it. Even the folk idea that emoji are gesture, even though what I'm really saying is that gesture and emoji have similar pragmatic functions, and really they're like a third thing, which is this general pragmatic thing. But that's too complicated for the public. So the folk idea that emoji are gesture, or emoji are like gesture, allows you to reason better about emoji than the folk idea that emoji are language. Because you can say, oh, gesture doesn't replace language. It's not a substitute for language. You don't gesture all the time. Just because we have gesture doesn't mean that language is going away. Oh, look at that. I guess we don't need to have a moral panic anymore. That's great. And you don't need to use gesture, you can use gesture as accompanying words. You can do gesture all by itself if you want to play charades, but you don't normally talk that way. You normally do it alongside of words. So that's great. There are specific emoji that correspond to specific gestures. So there's a thumbs up emoji, there's a middle finger emoji, and there's a rolling eyes and a winking face emoji. So there's some nice intuitive correspondences. It's fairly easy to remember. People have a folk idea of what a gesture is, which is close enough to accurate. I very, 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 very carefully never say the word sign language in any of this, because sign languages are their own thing, as we all know. And as I know from interacting with the media, if I say the word sign language anywhere, it's just going to get tossed into the mix, and that's not what I want to assert. But gesture, your folk idea of gesture, even though this can kind of decay, this can turn into a better replacement story than emoji as language. I've been field testing this one for a while, and it took me several years to come up with it, so coming up with a replacement story is not always immediately evident. Even though I was familiar with this literature, it didn't occur to me that I needed a better replacement story, and then it took me a while to find a good one and stress test it. But just saying, no, 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 not, was not working for me. So I tell this in story form to give you a narrative for how you could do differently, and maybe learn this faster than I did. Here's another thing, terminology. I'm gonna let you mull over this while I take a nice sip of water. So, here's a question I'm going to pose, which is what's the role of terminology when it comes to an explanation? So, here's the thing. We know from memory, we know from second language acquisition, we know from various means that people take something around 20 to 400, the literature varies, exposures on the new word to learn it, generally. And introducing too many new words at once imposes a cognitive load on the listener or on the reader. And so people can probably only remember one term, maybe two if they directly contrast, from your lecture. I had gone to, at a previous institute, which I'll remain nameless because I don't remember which one it was, at a previous institute, which I'll remain nameless, I went to a very good talk about something about historical linguistics, I think, but it might not have been. Anyway, it was a very good talk. I enjoyed the talk greatly. I live tweeted the talk. I'm not intending to criticize the speaker of this talk. And they very clearly introduced one word that they were using to explore this very interesting idea. The next day, and certainly not now, I could not remember what this one word was that they were using their entire talk. I remembered kind of the idea they were talking about. I remembered I liked the talk. I did not remember this one word that was the crux of their talk. If you think people can remember more than one word from you, the problem is you're letting them decide which word they remember rather than choosing for them. So if you give people too many words, you can give them too many words and they'll think they remember them at the time, but they won't. And so you're letting the fallibility of human memory and the selectivity of attention decide for you which bit people are actually going to retain, rather than picking 4 people, you're the expert on the topic, you should decide which word they should leave with. And so if you think of that up front, which word do I want people to leave knowing, or which concept do I want people to leave knowing, rather than introducing stuff like this. So how does this pan out? Here's how I operationalize this principle. Ooh, operationalize, that's a word. That sounds very, very corporate. The way that I do this is I say, terminology should be the point of the explanation. The entire crux of the explanation should be this word. People should be asking you, what an interesting concept, is there a word for it? Rather than you throwing a bunch of new vocabulary at them. Here's how this often plays out in pop linguistics. So, a lot of us learn about linguistics. You know, your kind of classic Ling 101 lecture, your classic interlinguistics textbook, often does something like, linguistics is a scientific study of language. Linguistics can be divided into the following subfields: phonetics and phonology, study of sounds, morphology, the study of bits of words, whatever we're defining morphology as these days, syntax, the study of sentences, semantics, the study of meaning, pragmatics, the study of meaning in social context, and then sometimes you go on to define other ones: sociolinguistics, study of language and society, psycholinguistics, study of language, brain function. So the problem with this, right, is we as linguists do know what all these words mean. Probably most of us, most of the time, is depending on whether you believe that morphology exists. I like morphology a lot. Whether you believe syntax exists, whatever. Depending on whether you believe any of these subfields exist. I think I went through points in grad school when I was convinced each of them separately must not exist. So, but we know, we have a sense of what they mean. And when we think of the breadth of the field as a whole, we think, oh yeah, some of my colleagues are phoneticians, some of my colleagues are semanticists, etc., etc. So this feels like an appealing way for us to introduce the field because it is, in many cases, how we were introduced through no fault of our own, and it is also how you might look at the field if you have a big picture like that. The problem is, you've now left people trying to decide which of these terms they're going to retain, and the answer is probably 0. And so, back when I did more editing of pop linguistics, when I don't do as much editing now, a lot of people wanted to start their article about a very particular phenomenon by first introducing all of the subfields of linguistics. A lot of people wanted to start their article about some particular, phonetic phenomenon by first introducing the entire IPA. And this makes sense in a classroom context where what you're trying to do is build an entire scaffold in people's minds, and where, crucially, you can send the students home and make them make flashcards of all the new words that you have thrown at them, because you're not relying on them retaining them from your lectures. There's going to be a test, and you can make them study for it. Unfortunately, you cannot make the general public study for your tests. I've tried, it doesn't work. I haven't tried, because I knew it wouldn't work. Okay, so it's very tempting, if you're doing an explanation of, say, some particular semantic phenomenon, to start your explanation by saying, this is something from semantics, which is the study of meaning. And here's this thing that I'm going to talk about, I don't know, quantifiers or something. I'm going to talk about this interesting sub-example from semantics. The problem is, if what you've said is semantics, the study of meaning, or phonetics, the study of sound, the only information you have really given the reader or the listener is the study of meaning and the study of sound. You have not given them any more information. They have not really learned what phonetics is or what semantics is the way they would if they were taking a class on it. All you've really said is the study of sound. So if all you're going to do is define a term with a parenthetical, cut the term, promote the parenthetical to the full clause, and then nobody has to increase their cognitive load by trying to remember a new term that they're not sure if it's relevant or not. If you want to write something where the entire point is, this is what semantics is, or this is what phonetics is, then that's your one term. It's the point of the explanation. But if it's going to be incidental, you can often gain a lot by cutting the additional vocabulary that you're trying to introduce people to and just keeping it down to that one term that you really want to make people lead with. I have an anecdote from an LSA annual meeting in 2015, I think? Anyway, a number of years ago. And I had a linguist come up to me and say, I'm so pleased to see you, etc. You're the reason why. My completely non-linguist friend came up to me and knew what selectional restriction was. And I said, how the heck did your friend learn what selectional restriction was, and how was I responsible? And it turned out that I had written an article, which, I did remember I had written this article, about the linguistics of the Doge meme, which some of you may recall. If you don't, the meme's kind of dead now, but the article's still quite interesting. Because it's really just syntax, it's very interesting. And what makes the Doge meme work, so you do phrases like such meme, very linguistics, wow, things like that. What makes the Doge meme work is that you have a selectional restriction mismatch. And that's what makes it seem like a stylized sort of ungrammaticality. And so in this article, I had decided this one term that I really wanted to include, that I really wanted to pay off, that I really wanted the public to learn, was selectional restriction. I didn't try to teach them the word syntax. I didn't even try to teach them the word noun or the word adjective, because people kind of know what those are, but they're not very good at them. Instead of saying, I didn't try to teach them count nouns or mass nouns, all of which are super relevant for this article. I decided the one term I was going to try to get to the public was selectional effing restrictions. And it turned out it worked, as evidenced by this friend of a friend who somehow managed to retain selectional restriction from this article because it was the crux of the explanation. It was the thing that made everything worth it. There's a word for this, there's an answer for this, and this turns out to be selectional restriction in this very specific context. So there's a temptation, I had a temptation writing this article to be like, oh, you need all this backstory to understand what selectional restriction is. And you do if you're teaching it in a class and you want people to have a full view of how syntax works or how people have analyzed verbs or something like this. But if all you have is 800 words, or all you have is one chapter of a book or one episode of a podcast, so this is something that I did with the book as well. Per chapter I had about one word. And something we do with the podcast episodes, for every half hour, we decide what our one word is. Sometimes it's 0 words. Sometimes it's 1 word, what it's going to be. Sometimes you can even challenge yourself and try to do an explanation introducing 0 new words, which is a good way to figure out what the one new word you really need is. To say, I'm going to no new words for anybody. Don't define anything. It's an explanation, not a definition. I did this on Twitter a year or so ago, and I was talking about, voicing assimilation. You have cats, but dogs, and this kind of classic intro linguistics example. And I was doing this whole thing, and I was talking about, this, and so every single time I said that buzzy thing that your vocal cords make, that buzzing feeling in your throat, I just kept repeating the description every time. Because if I repeat the description, I'm putting the cognitive load on myself to remember to repeat the description each time, but I'm not putting the cognitive load on the reader, who has to remember what the word voicing means every time I use it. So rather than saying the buzzing feeling in your throat, I can keep repeating that, or that buzzing, or just keep talking about buzzing and not buzzing, which means that the listener doesn't have to retain their memory of what voicing is, even though I defined it 4 tweets ago. Can't you remember this? No, people can't. And by the end of it, because I hadn't even introduced the term, somebody was saying, this is so great. Is there a word for this phenomenon? I was like, yes, thank you. Glad you asked. Let me introduce you to voicing. And this person was pleased and excited to learn this word, rather than being like, you've talked about this voicing, I don't get why it's important. And this brings us to, when do you get excited about learning a new word? So there are certain kinds of words that people get really excited about learning. And there are certain kinds of words that people don't get excited about learning. So when you learn the word Schadenfreude, this is an exciting word to learn, right? Because you're like, wow, I am not uniquely terrible. I'm not the only person that has ever taken pleasure in someone's misfortune. Other people have also done this, and they've created a word to describe this thing. I'm not the only terrible human. I assume all of you have felt, otherwise this has just been really embarrassing for me. So, you get excited to learn a new word when it's a concept that's already familiar to you, and then you get the word for it. And now you're excited because you have a convenient handle to carry this concept around with. you get less excited to learn a new word. So imagine walking into this room, let's say we're a high school English classroom, and I've written existentialism on the board. And I'm going to say, today, class, we're going to learn about existentialism. Existentialism is a movement that was born in France in, like, I don't know, maybe the 1900s? Whatever. You can tell I was paying attention in English class when I had my existentialism lecture. You know, some prominent practitioners of existentialism are Jean-Paul Sartre, Camus, and I still haven't friggin' told you what existentialism is. Right? I've given you all this background information. You don't know why you should care. And instead, what I could have said is, have you ever confronted the notion, the knowledge, that one day you will die? This is something that is uncomfortably familiar and very painful, but it is something that you have probably experienced before, and if you haven't, I kind of want your life. And have you ever experienced this feeling? There were some guys in France that felt this a lot, and they gave it a name. And now maybe you're a little bit more excited about existentialism than when I was starting with, you know, it comes from the Greek whatever, it doesn't come from Greek. It definitely comes from Latin. So we get excited about learning a new word when it touches on something that we're already deeply familiar with. And we can't all have the luxury of talking, you know, linguistics is often not talking about the knowledge that one day you must die, or the, you know, the feeling of pleasure in someone else's misfortune, or these kinds of like very soul-crushing topics. You know, sometimes we're just talking about sounds. What we can do with this is we can do a phenomenon called concept first, jargon second. And this means that whenever you have an explanation to give, you motivate the need for the explanation by explaining the topic. Like I did by saying, you know, the buzzing and not buzzing, and this explains a bunch of interesting things about what you can do with your voice. And then you can say, and by the way, this has a name, it's called voicing. It's called voicing assimilation, or whatever. If you start with, I have this concept called voicing assimilation that I want to explain to you, I'm already bored, and I know what it is, and I find it quite cool. So it is counterintuitive as experts, as people who do know these convenient word handles that we carry our concepts around in. You're familiar with reaching for your concepts by their word handle. This is a familiar thing for you to do. It's a natural thing for you to do because you know the words for these things. And you've learned them through experience, and it's convenient for you to reach for the handle first, and that's how you think of them now, because you have this nice package. But if I say, like, I've got a nice box here, it's got handles, like, it's great, you don't care that much. You care about what's in the box, what the handles are attached to. You know, you want to know whether this is a mattress with a handle, or whether this is a bucket with a handle, or whether this is a chair with a handle. You care that it's a chair, or it's a mattress, or a bucket. And then, once you care about it existing, the concept existing, then it's very convenient that it has handles. But the handle itself is not the selling point. The selling point is how interesting the concept is. There's a research study about this, concept first, jargon second, in case you like pedagogical research studies. There were some profs who did this with two different sections of like an intro biology class. And they gave one section the conventional reading, which is, you know, something like the mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, etc., these things. You know, like chloroplasts. I don't know. I haven't done biology in a while. Here's some biology terminology, they do stuff with it. And they gave the second group of students the same reading with the concept stripped out. So cells have parts, including the part that provides the energy, and including the part that does the other thing, that contains the information, and the part that, I don't know, does the other thing. It's been a long time since I did biology. And then the second group that got just the concepts reading, on the first few minutes of class after that, they said, so the concepts that we gave you in the reading, here are the names for the concepts that you were given. Just pretty much as simple as flipping the order. And the students that, they gave both sets of students the same post-test in their intro biology class, and the ones that had the concept first did a lot better on it. So this is something that can be fairly directly applied. Sometimes you can literally swap the order. Sometimes I literally swap the order of my own darn slides. Because I had this slide further up. And then I said to myself, no, Gretchen, you need to give them the story first. Because if you tell them concept first, jargon second before they get the story about the Schadenfreude, they won't retain it as well. Because every single time I give this explanation, I really want to start with concept first, jargon second, because that's how it's encoded in my mind. But the way to make it encoded in your minds is to start with the story about existentialism and Schadenfreude. And I know that this works because I've tried doing the concept first, jargon second bit, and people are like, yeah, okay, whatever. And then I tell the story, and they're like, that's cool, so what was that called again? And so I might as well just cut the terms from the top and put them in at the bottom when you've already bought into this idea that it would be useful to know them. So that's the main, these are some of the main ideas of explanation things that I have. I've done various other linguistics communication things at the previous institute. For example, we did a whole 4-week session on LingComm, so we went into a lot more details about a lot of this stuff and practiced it. The notes for that and for other LingComm workshops that I've done are all on Twitter in public because that's how I like to do communication. So if you want to see the link to this study, or if you want to see other links to various things, the notes for that are on twitter.com/LingComm, which will give you the LingComm account. Or if you want to tweet to me about LingComm, there's a hashtag LingComm that you can get this from as well. So those are some of the things. And if you want examples of LingComm that I do, as Georgia said in her very kind introduction, the podcast Lingthusiasm, you now know our trade secret, which is only one new piece of terminology per episode. And the book, which I do have a copy of here, unfortunately is my only copy, so you're not getting it. But I also have a few of these book cards with the book cover on them, so I don't want to take them back to Montreal with me. So if you want to come see me afterwards and say hi, I'm happy to give you one of these. And with that, I think we're going to take a 15-minute break, 10-minute break?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
10-minute break. 8-minute break. We're starting back again at 8 promptly here, so if you need to go to the bathroom, get yourself a drink of water, stretch a little bit, and then we'll be doing the 3-minute pieces in here in a bit.